He turned 70 on a quiet morning with no celebration, no cake, and no phone calls that lasted longer than a minute. The sun rose the same way it always did, slipping through the thin curtains of his small apartment, touching the edges of furniture that had not moved in years. He sat on the edge of his bed for a long moment, listening to the silence, the kind of silence that becomes familiar when it has been your companion for decades. 70 years old, he thought, and nothing in his life felt different from yesterday, except the weight in his chest felt slightly heavier. His name was Daniel. He had lived a life that looked complete from the outside. A stable job in his younger years, respect from colleagues, a reputation for being responsible and kind. He had taken care of his parents until their last breaths, sacrificed his own desires so his younger siblings could build families of their own. People often told him he was a good man, but no one ever called him a loved man, and he never corrected them, because love had never been part of his story. In his 20s and 30s, he told himself he was too busy. There was always something more important than romance, work deadlines, family needs, financial responsibilities. When friends married and drifted away into their own lives, he smiled and attended weddings alone. When coworkers spoke about their spouses, he listened politely and changed the subject. He convinced himself that love was optional, something some people needed and others could live without. It was easier that way, easier than admitting he was afraid of rejection, afraid of failure, afraid of being too late. Years passed quietly, like pages turning without sound. His parents died, his siblings moved away, the job that once defined him ended with a handshake and a retirement certificate. Suddenly, the days stretched long and empty. There were no meetings to attend, no urgent calls to answer. Just time, too much of it. Time that forced him to sit with thoughts he had avoided his entire life. Every morning followed the same routine. He woke up before the alarm, though he no longer needed one. He made tea in a chipped cup, sat by the window, and watched the city wake up without him. He read the newspaper slowly, not because he cared deeply about the news, but because it filled the silence. Sometimes he watched couples walking hand in hand below his apartment window, young lovers laughing, older couples moving slowly but together. He never felt jealousy. What he felt was confusion. He wondered what it must be like to have someone whose presence felt natural, necessary. Afternoons were the hardest. The hours between lunch and sunset felt endless. He often went to the park, not because he enjoyed it particularly, but because staying inside made the walls feel closer. He chose the same bench every day, fed the birds, and watched people pass by. He noticed things others didn't, how loneliness showed differently on every face, how some smiles were practiced, how some people talked loudly just to feel heard. At night, the loneliness grew louder. Without daytime distractions, his thoughts became heavier. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying moments from his past, not mistakes, but missed chances. He remembered the girl from his first job who used to wait for him after work, the neighbor who once invited him for dinner, the woman who smiled at him on the train for weeks before he changed routes. At the time, he had thought nothing of it. Now, those memories returned like unanswered questions. He never called it regret. He told himself regret was useless. But sometimes, in the quiet of the night, he wondered what his life might have looked like if he had been braver. If he had believed that he deserved love as much as anyone else. If he had taken even one risk with his heart. On his 70th birthday evening, he sat alone at the small table near his window. He lit a candle, not for celebration, but because the power had gone out briefly and he liked the warmth of the flame. Watching it flicker, he felt something unfamiliar rise inside him. Not sadness, not anger, a quiet longing, a question he had never allowed himself to ask: was it truly over? Or had something simply been waiting? He laughed softly at the thought. Love at 70, it sounded foolish. Life didn't work that way. Stories like that belonged in books and movies, not in real life. Especially not his life. He blew out the candle, went to bed, and told himself tomorrow would be just another ordinary day. He had no idea that tomorrow, for the first time in 70 years, his heart would begin to wake up. The next morning began like any other, yet something subtle had shifted inside him, though he couldn't name it. Daniel woke up earlier than usual and sat by the window longer than he normally did, watching the light spill across the street. There was a strange restlessness in his chest, not unpleasant, just unfamiliar. He finished his tea, folded the newspaper without reading it fully, and decided to go to the park earlier than usual, as if some quiet instinct was guiding him. The park was calm, wrapped in the soft sounds of birds and distant traffic. He walked slowly, feeling the ache in his knees, and headed toward his usual bench. But it was occupied. For a moment, he considered turning back. Routine mattered to him, change never came easily. Then he noticed her. She sat at the far end of the bench, holding a book open on her lap, though her eyes were lifted toward the trees. Her hair was silver, not carefully styled, just natural, and there was a peacefulness about her that drew his attention without effort. He hesitated, then cleared his throat gently. "Is this seat taken?" he asked, gesturing to the empty space between them. She looked up and smiled, a simple, unguarded smile that seemed to reach her eyes. "No," she said, closing her book slightly. "Please." He sat down, keeping a polite distance, feeling suddenly aware of his hands, his posture, his breath. It surprised him how nervous he felt over such a small interaction. For a few minutes, they sat in silence. Daniel focused on the birds, tossing crumbs as he always did. She watched quietly, then spoke. "They trust you," she said. "They come so close." He shrugged lightly. "I've been coming here a long time. I suppose they recognize me." She nodded, as if she understood more than just his words. "I come here often too," she said. "It helps me think." That was all it took. The smallest opening, for conversation to begin. They spoke about ordinary things at first. The weather, the trees changing color, how the park felt different in the mornings. Her voice was calm, steady, carrying no rush. Daniel found himself listening more than speaking, something he had always done, but this time it felt different. This time, he wanted to hear every word. When she laughed softly at something he said, he felt a warmth spread through him that startled him with its intensity. Her name was Eleanor. She lived a few streets away and came to the park to read when the house felt too quiet. He didn't ask what made it quiet, and she didn't ask why he always came alone. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a shared gentleness that needed no explanation. When she stood to leave, slipping her bookmark into her book, Daniel felt an unexpected disappointment. He hadn't realized how quickly time had passed. "It was nice talking to you," she said. "Maybe I'll see you again." He nodded, unsure why his throat felt tight. "Yes, I come here most days." She smiled again before walking away, and Daniel watched her until she disappeared down the path. He sat on the bench long after, his heart beating faster than it had in years, trying to understand what he was feeling. The days that followed were different. He began to look forward to the mornings, to getting dressed and heading to the park. When she wasn't there, he felt a quiet letdown he tried to ignore. When she was, his entire day seemed brighter. They spoke more each time, about music they liked, about places they had once dreamed of visiting, about memories that carried both joy and loss. Eleanor spoke of her husband, gone many years now, not with bitterness but with acceptance. Daniel listened, feeling both sympathy and admiration for her strength. One afternoon, as they walked slowly along the path, Eleanor asked him a question he hadn't expected. "Did you ever fall in love?" He stopped for a moment, surprised by his own honesty. "No," he said, "I don't think I ever did." She looked at him with curiosity, not pity. "Not even once." He shook his head. "I was always waiting for the right time. I think the time passed me by." She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she reached out and gently touched his arm. "Sometimes," she said softly, "time waits too." That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. His thoughts kept returning to her smile, her voice, the way she listened without interrupting. He felt confused, almost embarrassed. He was 70 years old. These feelings made no sense. And yet, they were undeniable. For the first time, he understood what people meant when they spoke of the heart feeling awake. It frightened him, but it also filled him with a quiet hope he had never allowed himself before. As the weeks passed, their connection deepened naturally, without pressure or expectation. They shared tea at a small cafe near the park, sat together watching sunsets, and spoke about fears they had never voiced aloud. Daniel found himself opening up in ways he never had, telling her about his loneliness, his missed chances, his belief that love was never meant for him. Eleanor listened, her eyes gentle. "Maybe," she said one evening, "love was meant for you all along." It was just patient. Those words stayed with him. Patient. The idea wrapped itself around his heart and settled there. He began to realize that what he was feeling wasn't confusion or foolishness. It was love, slow, quiet, and real. His first love. And it had come when he least expected it, at an age when he had thought all beginnings were over. As the days grew shorter and the air cooler, Daniel became aware of a change not only in the season but in himself. Love, he learned, did not rush him the way he had once imagined it might. Instead, it moved slowly, almost respectfully, as if understanding the years he carried. His meetings with Eleanor became part of his life in the most natural way, no promises, no labels, just a quiet agreement to keep showing up for each other. They began spending longer hours together. Some mornings they walked through the park without speaking much, letting silence sit comfortably between them. Other days, they talked endlessly, as if making up for decades of unshared thoughts. Daniel found that he was laughing more. Real laughter, the kind that surprises you when it escapes. He noticed small changes in himself. He stood a little straighter, shaved more carefully, chose his clothes with intention. It felt strange, almost embarrassing, to care so much again, but it also felt alive. Yet alongside the warmth, doubt followed closely. Late at night, when Eleanor was not beside him, his thoughts grew heavy. He questioned everything. What right did he have to love now, when so much of life was already behind him? What, if this was only temporary comfort, a shared loneliness mistaken for something deeper? He feared becoming a burden, feared that time would steal what little happiness he had just discovered. Love, he realized, was not only joy, it was vulnerability. Eleanor seemed to sense his inner struggle even when he said nothing. One afternoon, sitting across from him in the cafe, she studied his face quietly. "You're thinking too much again," she said gently. Daniel smiled weakly. "I've had 70 years of practice." She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. The contact was simple, yet it sent a tremor through him. "We don't need to define anything," she said. "We just need to be honest." Her words eased something tight in his chest. They began sharing their fears openly after that. Eleanor spoke of her loneliness after her husband's death, of the years she believed her heart had closed forever. Daniel spoke of his regret, how he had lived safely, carefully, and how that safety had cost him connection. There was no judgment between them, only understanding. They were two people who had survived life and were now, unexpectedly, learning how to live again. One evening, as they sat on the same park bench where they first met, Daniel watched the sun sink slowly behind the trees. He realized how precious time felt now, not as something to fear, but as something to treasure. Every moment with Eleanor felt deliberate, chosen. There was no illusion of forever, and perhaps that made their bond stronger. Love at their age did not dream of endless tomorrows, it valued today. Still, the outside world pressed in. A few familiar faces noticed them together and whispered kind questions masked as curiosity. "Aren't you too old for this?" someone joked once. Daniel laughed politely, but the words stayed with him. That night, he lay awake, wondering if he was being foolish. If society was right, if he should protect himself, and Eleanor, from disappointment. The next day, he almost didn't go to the park. Fear urged him to retreat into the safety of solitude he knew so well. But something stronger pulled him forward. When he saw Eleanor waiting on the bench, smiling the way she always did when she spotted him, his doubts softened. He understood then that love was not about permission. It was about courage. They took a slow walk that afternoon, and Daniel found himself talking without planning to. He told her how afraid he was, of losing her, of time, of loving too late. Eleanor stopped walking and faced him. "Daniel," she said, her voice steady, "we are not late. We are here." The simplicity of her words settled deep within him. That night, Daniel returned home with a clarity he had never felt before. Love had come into his life not to take something away, but to give meaning to what remained. He accepted that fear would always exist, but it no longer controlled him. He knew now that loving Eleanor was not a mistake or a final gamble. It was a choice, a brave, honest choice. And for the first time, he chose love without apology. As winter approached, Daniel felt emotions he had no words for. Love, he discovered, was not dramatic at this stage of life. It was quiet, steady, and deeply unsettling in the most beautiful way. Eleanor had become part of his days so naturally that he only realized her importance when she was not there. A morning without her felt unfinished, like a sentence without an ending. He had waited 70 years to feel this, and now that it had arrived, it frightened him. He began to notice how love changed the smallest things. Food tasted warmer when he imagined telling her about it later. Music on the radio carried meanings he had never heard before. Even silence felt different, less empty, more thoughtful. But with every new feeling came a shadow of fear. He worried about time, about health, about loss. Loving late meant loving carefully, knowing there were limits the heart could not ignore. Some nights, Daniel sat alone and argued with himself. He told himself this was foolish, that he should be grateful for companionship and nothing more. He reminded himself of his age, of the reality of aging bodies and uncertain tomorrows. But the heart did not listen to logic. It only responded to truth. And the truth was simple. He loved Eleanor. Eleanor, in her quiet wisdom, never rushed him. She understood the weight he carried because she carried her own. They spoke often about fear, not to escape it, but to face it together. She told him that loving again after loss had once terrified her too. That opening her heart felt like inviting pain back into her life. But loneliness, she said one evening, is its own kind of pain. Daniel knew she was right. Their bond deepened in moments that seemed insignificant to others. A shared umbrella in the rain. A slow walk when his knee hurt. Her adjusting his scarf without thinking. These gestures spoke louder than declarations ever could. Love, at 70, was not about passion alone, it was about presence. Still, the world reminded him constantly of their age. Curious looks, quiet judgments, even well-meaning concern from acquaintances who thought they were protecting him. Daniel tried to laugh it off, but doubt crept in. Was he being selfish? Was he stealing something fragile from Eleanor when time might soon demand it back? One afternoon, overwhelmed by these thoughts, he almost pulled away. He canceled their meeting, claiming fatigue. The truth was fear. Fear of loving deeply and losing everything. That evening, Eleanor came to his door anyway. She didn't scold him. She simply looked at him and said, "Running won't protect your heart. It will only keep it empty." Something broke open inside him then. He realized that for most of his life, he had survived by avoiding pain, and in doing so, had also avoided joy. Love had found him not to hurt him, but to remind him that life was still happening. That he was still capable of feeling, choosing, and giving. That night, Daniel made a quiet decision. He would stop measuring love by how long it might last and start valuing it by how real it was. He would not let fear steal the days he still had. Loving Eleanor was not a risk, it was a gift. And with that understanding, his heart, once cautious and closed, finally surrendered fully, not to youth, not to fantasy, but to a love that had arrived late and meant everything. The realization settled into Daniel slowly, like dawn breaking after a long night. Love had already changed him, whether he admitted it or not. He no longer counted his days by routines but by moments, moments spent with Eleanor, moments that felt complete. Yet one truth remained unspoken, resting heavy in his chest. He had never told her, in clear words, what she meant to him. At 70, he had learned many things, but courage in love was still new. One evening, as they sat together watching the sky turn gold and then blue, Daniel felt an urgency he could no longer ignore. Time, once something he barely noticed, now felt precious. He turned to Eleanor, his hands trembling slightly, and spoke honestly, without rehearsed lines or grand promises. He told her that she was his first love, the first person who had ever made his heart feel awake. He told her he wished he had met her earlier, but he was grateful beyond words that he had met her at all. Eleanor listened without interrupting, her eyes filled with emotion. When he finished, she reached for his hand and held it firmly. She told him that love was not measured by how early it begins, but by how deeply it is felt. She admitted that she had been afraid too, afraid of caring again, afraid of loss, but being with him had given her peace she thought she had lost forever. In that moment, there was no past and no future, only two hearts choosing each other. From then on, they lived with quiet intention. They did not rush or pretend they had endless time. Instead, they filled their days with meaning, shared meals, slow walks, gentle laughter, and conversations that stretched late into the night. Daniel found joy in simply being present, in knowing that love did not need to be loud to be powerful. It just needed to be real. There were still difficult days. His body ached more often. Some mornings, fear returned uninvited. But now, he did not face those moments alone. Eleanor's presence did not erase pain, but it softened it. Together, they learned that love at this stage of life was not about building a future, it was about honoring the present. On a quiet morning, sitting beside